but also the persons of the divine being itself, as well as the character of its substance, coalesce into the simplicity of what is without consciousness. This necessity has, in contrast to self-consciousness, the characteristic of being the negative power of all the shapes that appear, a power in which they do not recognize themselves, but on the contrary, perish. The self appears merely as a sign to the characters, not as the mediating factor of the movement. But self-consciousness, the simple certainty of self, is in fact the negative power, the unity of Zeus, of substantial being, and of abstract necessity. It is the spiritual unity into which everything returns. Because actual self-consciousness is still distinguished from the substance and fate, it is partly the chorus, or rather the crowd of spectators, whom this movement of the divine life fills with fear as being something alien, or in whom this movement as something close to them produces merely the emotion of passive sympathy. Partly, too, so far as consciousness is involved and belongs to the characters, this union is an external one, is a hypocrisy, because the true union, that of the self, fate, and substance, is not yet present. The hero, who appears before the onlookers, splits up into his mask and the actor, into the person in the play and the actual self. Paragraph 742 now begins a very important transition, and it's a double transition that's going to be taking place in this and the next paragraphs, moving us first within this section into comedy, which is going to be mentioned 2 paragraphs from now, and into the next large section, the last section of religion, which is the second to last section of the entire work. And we can say that the mask is going to become thematized and in some respect separated from the actor. There's a lot of mask language going on here, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And the mask isn't coming off quite yet. That's going to come in the next paragraphs, but it's certainly being focused on by the end of this section. So this one begins by talking about persons of the divine being itself, the character of its substance. I mentioned we'd get to some mask language later. Now's later. So persons, persona, is a Latin term that translates prosopon, which can be translated as face, but also as the masks that the actors would wear in ancient drama, right? And so we've already got some mention of this going on. The persons of the divine essences are not like, the persons of the Trinity or anything like that. They're rather the representations, the Vorstellungen that are being put forward as what they are. And notice that Miller says divine beings. The German here is actually Göttliche Wesen. So we're talking about essence, not just being. And then he talks about the character of their substance. Again, Miller's missing that in this. Its substance, right? What's the it? The divine being, the divine essences. Seine, right? So we have not just a single divine being, but all these beings. And we notice that they're going to, like he says, the persons of the divine being itself, the character, coalesce into the simplicity of what is bewusstlos, what is without consciousness. This is very interesting, right? Because now we don't have just a opposition between, Bewusstsein, consciousness, and Selbstbewusstsein, self-consciousness. We have a split occurring between what lacks consciousness altogether, what can actually only be an object or a force, that self-consciousness, as a kind of consciousness, is going to encounter and figure. So he tells us that this necessity, Notwendigkeit, has, in contrast to self-consciousness, the characteristic of being the negative power. We're going to get two negative powers here. The negative power of all the shapes that appear, a power in which they, now we have to be careful here, do not recognize themselves. It's not anerkennen, it's just erkennen. They don't recognize, they don't know, they don't have familiarity with what they are, and that makes perfect sense. If they not only don't have self-consciousness, they don't have consciousness, how are they going to have any sort of recognition of anything? And then he says they don't recognize themselves but perish. The self appears merely as assigned to the characters, not the mediating factor of their movement. So the self that's involved here, if there is indeed any sort of self, is not doing any sort of self-like work. And it may as well not even be a self. Then he shifts over to talking about self-consciousness. Self-consciousness, the simple certainty of self, is in fact the negative power. So where does the real negative power lie? There's kind of there's a negative power here, but it's not really going to its roots. The self is the genuine negative power. He says the unity of Zeus, of substantial being, and of abstract necessity. So that sounds pretty good. It sounds like everything that's important on this side of necessity is actually getting sucked over onto this side. Substance, the ethical substance, fate, Schicksal, right? Zeus that we talked about in the last couple paragraphs. Substantial being, abstract necessity, the spiritual unity into which everything returns. That's self-consciousness. But yet it isn't. It hasn't actually been brought through to its end, because the next thing that he says is actual, wirkliche, right? The real self-consciousness of people involved is still distinguished from the substance and from fate. And so then he says it's partly one thing, partly another. So, and here it can be a little bit confusing. I think that the way that we have to put this together is breaking this up into the chorus and spectators and then the hero. And then we've got this bridging thing about realizing hypocrisy, realizing that the true union is not yet present. So what do we have on the side of the chorus? Notice that he says it's partly the chorus, or rather the crowd of spectators. And we've noted this connection between chorus and spectators, which Hegel has highlighted several paragraphs back before. The chorus is, in a certain sense, people within the drama that help to frame things, but they're also giving the spectators an entrance into the drama. The spectators are maybe identifying to some degree with the chorus. The chorus gives them some cues about what they're supposed to be feeling. Hegel here reverts to the Aristotelian quip about tragedy. I don't even want to call it a theory of tragedy at this point. That has to do with catharsis of two main emotions, fear, Furcht, right? And sympathy is how Miller is translating it, Mitleiden, which earlier translation, pity, right? Fear and pity, that Aristotle says that tragedy is supposed to cleanse us of or purify us of. So the chorus, the crowd of spectators, the movement of divine life fills with fear as being something alien, or in whom this movement is something close to them, produces merely the emotion of passive sympathy. These emotions are being felt. Now, notice that Hegel is not making these absolutely central to the essence of tragedy, right? He's saying, well, that's what's going on with those people who are watching. Then we also have the hero. He says the hero, this is how the paragraph ends, who appears before the onlooker, splits up into his mask and the actor, into the person in the play and the actual self. The person in the play is the character, right? The thing that's represented over on the other side. The actor is the genuine self. Before that, though, he says, partly too, so far as consciousness is involved and belongs to the characters, so the characters have consciousness now, right? The union is an external one, is a hypocrisy. Now, why Hypocrisy has a double sense here, in the sense of noting a contradiction within itself, a Widerspruch, right? He doesn't use the term Widerspruch there, but speaking against, right? Where you say one thing, but the next thing that you say contradicts that, or the context in which you say something contradicts what your speech act is, right? So that's one sense of hypocrisy. An older sense of hypocrisy is one who actually puts on the mask, one who does a performance. So it's very much tied in with this. I'd say that ambiguity there. And he says that, why is this a hypocrisy? Now we have a third reason. Why? Because the true union, that of the self, fate, and substance, is not yet present. The self is on the side of actual self-consciousness. Substance and fate are along for the ride, but not yet integrated with it. And so, at this point, there's kind of a disunity of things that are supposed to be all coming together in a unity. And this opens up a door for the mask to come off. The self-consciousness of the hero must step forth from his mask and present itself as knowing itself to be the fate both of the gods of the chorus and of the absolute powers themselves, and as being no longer separated from the chorus from the universal consciousness. Paragraph 743 is a very short one, and there's actually not an awful lot going on here, so it shouldn't take too much to unpack. It seems pretty straightforward. The self-consciousness of the hero, what are we talking about there? In the previous paragraph, we had the hero essentially splitting into the mask and the actor who is portraying the hero. The actor is now going to assume more importance qua actor, qua human being. And the mask is Vorstellung, it is representation. We have an interesting use of vocabulary here in relation to that. So the self-consciousness of the hero does two things here. He says it steps forth from his mask, right? So it's taking the mask down, or doing something that reveals that there is more than just the mask, more than just the representation there. And that is hervortreten, right? It steps out. Now, Hegel might be referencing a part of old comedy in which the actors actually did take off their masks, apparently, and harangue audience members by name, calling them out on stuff. But we can also read this in so many other ways. When we talk today about breaking the fourth wall, it's interesting because it could be the actor breaking the fourth wall, or it could be the character breaking the fourth wall, and that's part of who the character is. By definition, the actor has to break the fourth wall, but as character, as masked, right? So it does that, and then it presents itself. Now, presenting itself is a translation of darstellen, right? So we have this stellen term that is there also in Vorstellung, the representation, picture thinking. And in both cases, there's a Stellung, a placing, and, dar, there, for, in front. So there's some connections there. And also a difference, right? So it presents itself. We might ask, presents itself to who? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Presents itself as what? Knowing itself, and that's, the verb there is weisen, weiss, it knows itself in the sense of having cognitive, propositional knowledge, you could say, to be what? The fate, the Schicksal of two things. Of the gods of the chorus. Now, why the gods of the chorus? Why single out that as the understanding of gods? Well, because the chorus is this intermediary between us, the audience, the spectators, and the actual drama that's taking place, so the gods that the chorus recognizes, and the absolute powers themselves. And then he says something else that brings in the chorus that's kind of interesting. The hero, or the actor, the self-consciousness of the hero, is no longer separated from the chorus, no longer getrennt, no longer divided off from the chorus. So does that mean that the character, the hero, is now just one more schmuck in the crowd of, the guards or the old men of the town or whoever it's supposed to be? Well, it's not quite clear. The chorus here is figured as the universal consciousness. Now that's, in the past, the chorus has been getting things wrong, but now the chorus is the universal consciousness. It's attained a higher status than it had. So maybe joining it isn't quite so bad for the hero, right? And he says that's where it ends. Now we should think about, well, who is he representing or presenting himself to? To himself? To the chorus itself? To us, the spectators? What's going on here? This is not something that is really happening in the play itself. This is happening within the movement, in Hegel's view, I would say, of Greek drama. And here he's doing something that's rather ahistorical and more conceptual. He's saying that comedy is emerging out of some of the unresolved issues of tragedy. Tragedy understood not just as an art form, but as a way of making sense of God's self-consciousness, the universe, fate, all these really important moral and metaphysical terms or concepts or realities. Comedy has, therefore, above all, the aspect that actual self-consciousness exhibits itself as the fate of the gods. These elementary beings are as universal moments, not a self, and are not equal. They are, it is true, endowed with the form of individuality, but this is only in imagination and does not really and truly belong to them. The actual self does not have such an abstract moment for its substance and content. It, the subject, is raised above such a moment, such a single property, and clothed in this mask, it proclaims the irony of such a property wanting to be something on its own account. The pretensions of universal essentiality are uncovered in the self. It shows itself to be entangled in an actual existence and drops the mask just because it wants to be something genuine. The self, appearing here in its significance as something actual, plays with the mask which it once put on in order to act its part. But it as quickly breaks out again from this illusory character and stands forth in its own nakedness and ordinariness, which it shows to be not distinct from the genuine self, the actor, or from the spectator. In paragraph 744, Hegel is now going to thematically turn to talking about comedy. Now, if you're looking for a general theory of comedy in this and the next 3 paragraphs to follow, you're going to be rather disappointed because he's not actually providing that, not even just of Greek comedy and not just even of old comedy as opposed to new comedy, but he is telling us something that's quite important. And in the paragraphs to come, we're going to see some connections between comedy and some of the earlier shapes of consciousness that we've encountered, for example, in the self-consciousness section. I think there's a connection there with skepticism, right before the unhappy consciousness, in the reason section, and in the spirit section. We'll talk about that when we get to those paragraphs. So he's actually referencing comedy in the German, right? So very clear what he's talking about. And he says it has the aspect that actual self-consciousness, wirkliches Selbstbewusstsein, the one that we've seen talked about in the 2 previous paragraphs, associated with the actor as opposed to the character, exhibits itself as the fate of the gods. Now, in the previous 2 paragraphs, The self-consciousness, the actual self-consciousness, was not yet integrated with fate, Schicksal, right? Let alone the fate of the gods. Now it is going to be connected with that, and in a way that is going to turn the gods into something less godlike, something that's prefiguring what is happening in the next section. So he says these elementary beings, elementary Wesen, right, essences, are as universal moments, not a self. Not a self. This is going to be very important. The gods are stand-ins, figureheads in a way within culture. Now, this is when we get to a certain point of cultural development, right? It is not the earlier viewpoint, much more pious, much more reverent towards the gods. The gods are coming down now as something where we can say, well, what is Zeus actually going to do? Well, Apollo, interesting concept. I don't know that there's a person who's Apollo. No self. And then there's something that has to be like a misprint here in Miller's translation, because he says they're not equal. The German actually says wirklich, not actual, right? And he says that they're endowed with the form of individualities, right? So they're characters in the drama, right? Just as they were in the epics beforehand, but only in imagination. Nur eingebildet, only depicted inwardly. That's what eingebildet could be translated as here. And I think we should think about imagination not just as the individual imagination, that of the spectator, that of the playwright, but we could talk about cultural imagination. So Hera, so Artemis, so Hermes, all these gods that we associate with things, even like the crazy things that we're not quite sure where to fit them in, like the various titans, or demigods. They're just builded, they're just, painted or sketched within language, within culture, within our own minds, and on the stage, and in the stage directions that comprise a script. So he says, individuality does not really and truly belong to them. Individuality in the sense of agency, individuality in the sense of responsiveness, individuality in all these things that we connect with it. And then he goes on and he says, the actual self does not have such an abstract moment for its substance and content. It's not a God. It is somebody else. The actual self, wirkliche Selbst, right? Actual is doing a lot of work in this paragraph, isn't it? The actual self is a subject. It doesn't have such an abstract moment for its substance and its content, its substance and its inhalt, what it is that it is. It, the subject, is raised above such a moment, such a single property, and clothed in it this mask. It proclaims, and here Hegel uses the word irony, Ironie, right? The irony of such a property wanting to be something on its own account. Let's pause there for a moment, because this goes all the way back to the thing in its properties, doesn't it? Think about salt, one of the examples that Hegel used in that section in the consciousness portion of the work. Salt is white, cubical, has a certain taste to it. Now, that's the part of it that we would probably be most tempted to say, there's the essence, the salty taste. But that is just a property. It is not the subject of which it is predicated. It's not the subject in which it inheres. And now Hegel says that this subject, at this point, is through the mask, right? That's going to change very quickly in this paragraph. A subject is something that is more than just any one of its properties, right? So he says there's an irony of a property wanting to be something on its own account. What does he mean by irony? Usually we take that to mean something like Socratic irony or incongruity, and it actually works for both of these. In a way, a property wanting to claim itself to be more than what it is either ironic or misfounded, right? So going on here, he says, here we go, the pretensions of universal essentiality, that's over here, right? Wesenheit, are uncovered in the self. The self shows itself to be entangled in actual existence. If it is an actual self, it exists in actual existence. It exists not just within the ideality, the imaginative space of the play, but as the support, again, another term of subject, right, for the drama itself. All of these actors are real people who are on a real stage that has been decorated with whatever, real spectacle. We don't know what opsis really means in ancient tragedy, but it's definitely an important thing because Aristotle tells us that in Poetics Book 1. If we only had Poetics Book 2 to help inform this concept of comedy. In any case, going on, there's a real support to this, entangled in actual existence. The actors are going to take a break and go off and have something to eat to, deal with their famished stomachs that they haven't been paying attention to while they've been hiding behind their mask and putting themselves into their performance. Some of them are going to go off to the bathroom, and do their things there. Some of them are going to have to, if they don't have masks, retouch their makeup, or they're going to have to readjust their mask or their costume. The director might come out and say, okay, good job, everybody. Now let's have a great second act. These are all actual existence that we're entangled in. So he goes on and he says, it drops the mask. Now, here we have a really interesting motivation coming up. Why does it drop the mask? Because it wants to be, as Miller translates it, something genuine. Now, the German here is etwas rechtes. Not just genuine, not just echtes, rectus, right? So it wants to be something that really is doing justice to whatever is going on. It wants to be right. Right in the very primordial sense of the term. Not just conforming to certain rules or something like that. Right in the sense of displaying something that truly is the way it is. Think about all the actors over millennia playing, if not just behind masks, but behind makeup, behind characters, and so many of them having to be a certain part, oftentimes not speaking, only saying the lines that they're allowed to, maybe getting to ad-lib once in a while, if they're, allowed to, if they're in the elite. And they are stuck behind this mask. They feel themselves to be good at faking. Well, at some point they actually want to let the mask down and say, here's what I'm really like. Here's what I have to say. So he says, it's entangled in actual existence, drops the mask because it wants to be something genuine. The self, appearing here in its significance as something actual, plays with the mask, which it once put on in order to act its part. But it as quickly breaks out again from this, what's the mask? An illusory character, and stands forth in its own nakedness and ordinariness, which it shows to be not distinct from the genuine self, the actor, or from the spectator. Now, this last passage that concludes this paragraph is bringing up something about comedy that we did get from Aristotle and that Hegel is incorporating here without referencing him. The person in tragedy, the character is supposed to be this very important person who has a tragic flaw or screw up, however you want to translate hamartia, sin, right? The person in comedy is more like the rest of us schmucks, the rest of us schlubs, the rest of us slobs out there in the audience who are not, perfect people. We're not, totally imperfect either. We are kind of a mix and a mess. And if we're developing, we're on the way. The actor reveals themselves to be like that, different than the character, than their playing, standing forth in their own nakedness and ordinariness, right? Not distinct from the genuine self, the actor, or from us, the spectator. Comedy is comedy in part because we can see ourselves in there a little bit more, ourselves, not just some ideal self, but ourselves in it. So we've got a very interesting contrast going on here between the actual self and subject and between the self and the mask within it, as compared to the gods who are now in a not necessarily one down position, but certainly without any real agency or selfhood of their own.